I'm really excited to talk to you today specifically about two issues that are often really difficult to wrap our heads around, but that we're always being told are really important. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and culture. What we're going to focus on today is what does it actually take to create the conditions for everyone to thrive at work? With the company that I run, we think that it's a really specific approach that gets you to results. So instead of talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of a set of legal principles or moral philosophies or policies, we talk about DEI like a competency, a skill that you build, like collaboration or communication or innovation. And when you build this competency, you strengthen your competencies in these other areas too. But to do it well, we often start too late. We focus on unconscious bias or implicit association or allyship when we actually need more basic skills to even be able to have those discussions. So let me ask you a question. How many people here have been through some kind of unconscious bias training? Raise your hands. Okay, so about half of us. And how many of us understand or feel like we understand the concept of allyship? Okay, another half here. So in order to really get to results that are practical, that are actionable, we have to start really simple. We have to start with listening. Because the reality is, when we listen, we can understand, we can make changes, we can extract information and knowledge that allows for us to take a more practical approach to solving these problems. But if we're not listening to each other, it doesn't matter how much we want to be allies, or how much we want to be advocates, or how much we recognize our unconscious bias, because we don't actually know how it impacts the people that we really want to connect with. So that's what we're going to focus on today, how we build this core skill of active listening so we can apply it to achieve better DEI outcomes. The way that we're going to do this today is pretty simple. We're going to spend some time understanding why active listening matters, and we're going to understand what that specific technique is, because contrary to popular belief, it's not just listening really hard, it's an actual technique. And then from there, we're going to understand diversity, equity, and inclusion and what those terms mean. We want to make sure we're all talking about the same words all the time so that we've got that shared understanding. And then from there, we're going to talk about how we can use active listening to achieve those DEI outcomes. This is an interactive session. I'll be making you talk to each other, so brace yourselves for that. And the other thing I want to emphasize is this is 45 minutes to talk about some really complicated topics. If you're in this room thinking to yourself, how do I get an A+ at this talk? How do I make sure that I win the quiz? I'm not saying that you're like this, but I am, and I've been trying to win at all of these talks this week. There are only 3 things you actually need to learn, and they're right here. So when you're thinking about what you should take away from today, the first is that as humans, we're imitators. Okay, so the biggest thing for us is if we can model good behaviors, other people around us will change. There's actually a practice called engraving. And in engraving, you watch someone do something well enough times without trying to imitate them, and you start imitating them automatically. So if you want to improve your tennis backhand, you can watch Maria Sharapova videos on YouTube for 2 weeks in a row, and all of a sudden your backhand will look more like hers. The way our brains are wired. So if we can really model out these good active listening skills, the people around us will follow. The second objective that we have for today is to really understand that we don't listen to people who are not like us. It is cognitively difficult. It's not because we're bad people, or because they're not interesting, or because we can't relate to each other. It's because it's hard. When we have to process information, it requires more from us, and we have to process information that's unfamiliar to us. It creates a guardedness. So to give you a sense, in the middle of the day, between the hours of 2 and 4, when our brains basically just totally shut down, we need twice as much glucose just to be able to listen to somebody else talk. That's what our brain needs to keep up the brain power. But if we have some good skills in place that allow us to be more active in our listening, we can listen to people who are not like us, even when we are at lower energy states. And then finally, the last objective for today is that every single person here can be a better listener. And you can apply that to creating better relationships with people at work, with people in your lives, and ultimately drive business outcomes as a result. It leads to really good DEI outcomes, but it also just makes your lives better. One of the things that I talk about a lot when I do my sum-ups or I do my check-ins with my clients is the fact that active listening spreads throughout their lives. And one of the things I hear most often is that because they have active listening techniques in place, they're better husbands and wives and partners because they can really be present for those conversations. Now, I really believe that active listening is the foundation for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the reason that I do is because I have lived this. So I'm Alita Miranda Wolf, and I run a company called Ethos, where company culture meets DEI, but what matters here is the reason that I started this company is because of the experiences that I had professionally. So I joined a venture capital firm early on in my career. I had been a consultant, and I had been a startup marketer, very familiar with inbound, HubSpot user, but I joined this venture firm, and I was the first woman ever hired full-time. I was the only Hispanic person working in venture capital in Chicago, and just one of 27 Latino women working in venture capital in the US. And I was the youngest VC director by 10 years nationally. And I can tell you, my job was to manage my investors, our Fortune 500 partners, our Silicon Valley investors, everything to do with our brand, and then our portfolio company growth. So I had 45 companies, and it was my job to make sure that they gave us returns. Now, I didn't look like anybody that I worked with, and certainly not like the investors I had to manage. I just didn't, and it was challenging. I can tell you that I was on the receiving end of a lot of "you know how women are" jokes, and I was introduced to a lot of girlfriends because we are both Hispanic and have so much in common, and I was asked how old I was while presenting in a boardroom on a regular basis, and I thought, this is really tough. I don't know that I can make this happen. And I didn't really have a lot of context for this because I come from a family of Cuban refugees, and when I was growing up, this was not a path. This was not an option. They say if you can't see it, you can't be it. This was very much like that for me. So I didn't have a great understanding of the environment I was going into, or what would be expected or required of me. And then I also just had this attitude from my parents. When I was 16 years old, I was watching Millionaire Matchmaker, true story, and one of the millionaires on the show was an entrepreneur, and I had never seen that word before. So I asked my mom, what's an entrepreneur? And she said, that is what you call yourself when you're unemployed and don't want to admit it. And so I'm now working with all of these entrepreneurs who've given a ton of money to who have to listen to me and don't know how. And all of these investors who don't know how to listen to our entrepreneurs and aren't making the right investments in terms of diversifying our portfolio and really making market moves. And I remember going to my managing director and saying, I don't feel lucky to be here. And I'm supposed to feel lucky. And we have a very serious problem, which is the companies that we want to invest in don't want our money. That's the paradox of venture capital. You only want to give your money to people who don't need it. And so they're going to take your investment because they want other things from you. And they did not want our investors, who did not understand them, who did not know how to listen to them. And I went to the Northwestern University campus, and I pulled together a team of data scientists to show what our reputation score was in this market. And it wasn't great. And he said, all right, fine. I don't understand what you are going through personally, and I don't understand what our entrepreneurs are going through. But I believe you. I'm going to listen to your perspective, and if you can fix it, you can do it. And so my first 2 years at this venture firm, my nickname, true story, was the Angel of Death, because I fired 60 of my own investors. And I know what it's like to be 22 years old and sit across from a billionaire and tell him that he is not good enough for you. And I know what his reaction is, which is not as gracious as you might imagine. And I know what it's like to take the rest of those people and teach them how to listen, how to empathize, how to understand, how to develop cultural competency so that they can invest differently and make better moves. And I know what it's like to bring more people into an organization to add to that diversity. So long story short, by the end of my 3.5 years of really launching this initiative, we had increased diversity in our investor base by 25%. We had gone from 3% female founded, which is the national average, to 20%. Similar numbers for people of color, and the top 3 performing companies in our portfolio were led by women or people of color. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, we had become the most active investor in the Midwest in our region. We did more deals and saw better returns, all with the only changes we made being DEI. But the thing is, this was only possible because of 3 different listening conversations that happened. My managing director listened to me. My investors were willing to listen to our entrepreneurs and really understand them. And our entrepreneurs were willing to listen to the broader community so they could engage with markets that maybe they hadn't seen before or hadn't interacted with before. So this is why I say I know listening matters, because it's where all change starts from, and it's what makes sure that we solve the right problems, because we find the right problems and then we build the right solutions. With that in mind, I want to emphasize how important it is that we get into a listening state of mind. So I want to take time to arrive here. I know some of you have been answering emails or walking around the conference center or talking to a combative colleague, and I want to make sure we take a moment to get present. So I'm going to ask that everybody just briefly closes your eyes. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to take 3 deep breaths. Follow your breath from the top of your inhale to the bottom of your exhale. And again, from the top of your inhale to the bottom of your exhale. Take that last breath, and when you release it, check in with yourself. How's your energy level? What's your mood? What's on your mind right now? Take a moment to notice whatever thought is swirling in your mind, and take a deep breath with it and release it. And now I want you to visualize the best listener you know. Who is the best listener you know? See that person's face. And now that you see that person's face, think about, how do they listen? What do they do that makes them the best listener you know? And finally, take a moment to reflect on, how do they make you feel when they listen? What feelings come up for you? When you're ready, you can take a final deep breath and slowly open your eyes. And I want you to turn to the person next to you, whether they're to your right or left, behind or in front of you. And just for the next minute or 2, I want you to talk about the best listener you know and what they do. So it should get really loud, really fast. Go. Start finishing up those last thoughts. So we were just practicing the first stage of listening. For one, I want to ask you a question. How many people here talked to someone they didn't know? Raise your hands. Good. That's what I like to see. So that's one of the keys here. We're trying to learn how to listen to people we don't know, that we're not familiar with, who are going to say and do unexpected things. And that's key. The other point that I want to emphasize is that you're practicing connecting with someone on a vulnerable level, because you're talking about someone that matters to you, and you're sharing reciprocally. So this is key for understanding the power of active listening. And I'm sure that in your conversations, a few themes came up. But I know from having done this workshop a number of times that really good listeners end up doing one key thing. And that's that they allow for people to tell stories in their own way, react freely and naturally, and do this all so they can express themselves fully. And one of the main reasons is because good listeners don't interrupt. They create that space for conversation. This research comes from Pauline Young, who found this in 1929 when she was studying what it took to get people to open up in social science interviews. And it was key to getting better research. It was key to getting better data so that they could understand social phenomena. But this is what makes somebody a good listener. And when we have this opportunity, when we have the space to be ourselves, to express ourselves freely, what happens is that all of a sudden mutual understanding increases. We also get to this place of sharing more knowledge, sharing more information. We get the full context. We learn to create what's called a no-penalty environment. Raise your hands if you know what a no-penalty environment is. Okay, a few of us. So a no-penalty environment, for those of us who are hearing it for the first time, is an environment where you can volunteer any idea without fear of consequence or retribution. And we know that no-penalty environments are where innovation comes from. If you're not afraid of sounding silly or stupid or being shut down, you're more likely to really brainstorm and come up with new ideas. When we're listening to each other well, we make each other feel seen. We create a sense of belonging. We build trust. Did anybody here go to Rachel Botsman's talk on trust? Anybody in the room? Okay, a few of us. I thought it was an excellent talk, and I am very interested in trust theory. One of the things that she talked about is that trust cannot be built. Trust has to be earned, because trust is all about somebody giving you their trust. When we listen, we are open to receiving. It allows for us to accept that gift. It creates trust, or it allows for us to earn trust, because we can see each other, and we can see each other reliably, consistently, and with empathy. And then finally, when we're really actively listening, we're opening up our perspectives and we're collaborating better. And this is the reason that businesses care about this, because it's how we get to productivity, it's how we get to performance. Now, all of this ties into a key element, which is culture. And we talk about company culture all the time in every company, constantly. And when I was a marketer, we were doing it too. So raise your hand if you feel like you have a very clear understanding of what culture is. Okay, maybe about a third of us. If you're not in that group, that's okay, because culture has 4 competing definitions. It can be very confusing, right? Culture is a group's particular way of life. That's what we're talking about when we talk about American culture or company culture. Culture is a mode of individual enrichment. So if you're well-read, you might be cultured, right? If you go to the theater or film festival, you might be getting some culture. I don't know why you would say it like that, but you could. It wouldn't be incorrect. And then if you're my husband, when you think about culture, you think about bacterial cultures, because he works in a lab, right? Maintaining in conditions suitable for growth. The challenge here, when we talk about culture, is that all of these ideas compete with each other sometimes. Right? A group's particular way of life may reject an activity. Isn't that the whole point of Footloose? Right? It's culture rejecting culture, right? And then a culture might say individual growth does not matter. Group interests do. So individual enrichment is not permitted or accepted. A culture might say that growth is not the goal, but maintenance, or in fact, keeping things smaller, downsizing or downgrading. But what I'm interested in, and what we're interested in here today, is what healthy culture is. And healthy culture in a group is very simple. It is a group of people coming together to define a good way of life, and then translating that idea of a good way of life into habits and activities and institutions so that individuals can flourish and the group can too. Now, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we talk about healthy culture, we understand why the two are inextricably linked, because if only some people can discover that good way of life together, it doesn't represent the group. And if only some people can participate in those habits, activities, and institutions, then we're not honoring that outcome. And then certainly, if only some individuals flourish, well, we're not in a healthy culture state, right? This is an absolute. What diversity, equity, and inclusion says is that what we're looking for is to create an invitation for people to come in, give them equal access so they can participate on the same playing field, and then really have the opportunity to connect. But when we think about invitation and equal access and connection, we need to be able to listen to people in order to create those things. So let's talk about our terms so we get on the same page. When we talk about diversity, we usually think we're talking about race and gender, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about variety. That's what diversity is. Diversity is variety. We can think about diversity in terms of biodiversity. So if we think about biodiversity, that's a lot of different kinds of organisms in one ecosystem. And biodiversity is important. Is anybody here obsessed with trees like I am by any chance? Oh, I'm really glad to hear that. There's some really good Radio Lab podcasts for you to listen to, but I love trees. I have actually gone on an expedition to go find a honey locust tree. That's the level of tree nerd that I am. And I like to think about this one example. In Central Europe, because of industrialization, basically all of the forests are new because they were all felled to produce lumber. And when those forests were replanted, they planted beech trees because beech trees grow really tall, really fast, and they make good quality wood. However, when a beech-specific virus hits the forest, well, the whole forest dies. If you plant, though, spruces and firs and birches, the beech trees die. The forest lives, but the seeds that were left from the original beech trees grow into new beech trees. When we think about diversity, what it allows for is both the mitigation of risk and the opportunity for growth. And that's key. Right? So when we think about diversity, we were thinking about composition, just who is in the room. And that can mean variability or variety in any number of ways, not just social identity. When we think about inclusion, though, it's not what or who is in the room, but how they feel. Inclusion is how we feel relative to being welcomed, valued, and fully leveraged for who we are. So we can feel included in our companies but not on our teams, or on our teams and not in our companies, or in our industries and not in our companies, or in our companies and not in our industries, right? It changes, it's in flux. I used to work in industrial supplies when I first started my technology consulting career, and I never thought about being a woman when I was on my team or in my company. I never thought about inclusion or exclusion. But when I would go to trade shows and there would be women in gold lame costumes dancing to sell power drills, I mean, honestly, I was just confused. But I also started to feel like maybe I wasn't included there, right? And so that's an example where you can feel inclusion to varying degrees in different places. So like diversity, inclusion is an outcome, right? Because it can have an endpoint, but it's a different kind, right? It's a feeling state. Diversity and inclusion can be defined in relation to each other, but clearly differentiated with one analogy, which is diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. So let me ask you this. How many people have been to a party that really sucked? Yeah, most of us have. So what did you do when you were at this bad party? Left? Anything else? Ate a lot of food? Okay, so you might leave, you might eat a lot of food. One of the CEOs who went through this with me said drank too much. So, make bad decisions, not stay, hang by the wall. Same thing is true. You can bring diversity into a company or into a culture or into your market or into your product. But if you don't take the time to include, then what you get is a lot of people who are leaving, underperforming, or unhappy, right? That's how we can understand them together. Now, you might have noticed that I don't say diversity and inclusion, but I say diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a reason for this, because I don't actually think that you can get from diversity to inclusion without a concept called equity. Just so that I have a sense of the room, raise your hands if you've heard this term before, equity. Good. I'm glad to hear it. When I think about equity, equity is really the relationship between power and fairness. And I want to take a moment here to define power, because power is very neutral. We don't talk about it neutrally, but power is neutral. Power is just what happens when two or more people come together, because power is being able to do what you want to do or having someone else do what you want them to do. What equity says and understands is that power is not equally distributed. So as a result, some people have more advantages and more people have disadvantages based on structures or systems that are outside of their control. And what equity aims to do is create more balance in that power structure. The best way I can describe this is if we want to say, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, equity says, okay, but make sure everybody has boots. Let's give everybody boots. And then they can pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Sometimes equity can be hard for people to understand, so I like to use an example from my own life to illustrate it. When I was in college, I got hit by a car crossing the street. So I ran across the street, I flipped over the car twice, shattered my whole right side, have a bionic arm here. They still teach my x-rays at Northwestern. It was a bad accident. And I heard from everyone that I needed to take a leave of absence. And one of the biggest challenges for me is I'm from Chicago. Winters are real in Chicago, and it was the dead of winter. I lived off campus, and I couldn't walk, and I couldn't move my right side. How was I going to get to school? Well, I went to the University of Chicago, and they have a program, which is that if you have a disability and you live off campus, it doesn't matter who you are, what year you are, what your standing is, whether you have a scholarship or not, doesn't matter. You will get a free shuttle to the university. They don't tell your professors to help you out or give you extra time on tests or give you better grades. They don't give you preference in selecting your courses. They just make sure that you can get to school just like everybody else. And it's not personal, but it allows for personal growth and gain. That's an equity practice. Now, if we want to get there, to this place where we can really operationalize equal access, we have to establish stakes, because the reality is we know that we can make changes when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's through equity. Equity is how we make changes in companies, and equity doesn't feel very interesting. And it's really easy to put it at the bottom of the list because it's systematic and process-based. So we have to feel like we have stakes. We have to feel like there's someone we care about who can't get to school before we put that program in place. And that's where becoming better listeners is key. So that's where we get to talk about active listening. Active listening is a technique that was developed in 1957 by Carl Rogers and Richard Farson. And the whole goal was, how do we collaborate better? There were other listening techniques that existed at this time, and they were much more counseling specific, but they weren't about getting to business outcomes. So what they decided was to build this framework that was made up of 3 parts. The first was listening for total meaning. So that's content and context. Not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it. Your tone, your energy, your body language. Then, responding. And this is something that's really important, because when we think about active listening, we think that we're mirroring, and we're not mirroring. We are keeping on to our own perspective and judgment, but we are definitely more focused on learning what the other person has to say than what our perspective is. So when we paraphrase in a responding situation, we note what has been said and the mood in which it has been said, and we continue sharing with open body language. And then finally, there's something called noting all cues, and this is making sure that you're keeping track of all of the verbal and nonverbal cues throughout the session. Key here for noting all cues, it's different from listening for total meaning, because this is the average that you take of a conversation. In that first step, it's moment by moment that you're paying attention. In that final step, it's how did we come out of that conversation together? So we can think about it this way. Good listeners create mental space. They allow for themselves to leave their own perspectives enough to concentrate on what the narrator has to say. They're not going through an internal monologue with themselves. If we were to compare active listening to our other listening styles, most of us are passive listeners all the time. That's because, like I said, listening is cognitively difficult. It's super tiring. And there's a reason why the Buddhists actually characterize listening as scary, right? So the Buddhists say that there are 5 core fears: death, pain, humiliation, but they also say unknown states of mind, Listening is hard because it opens us up to information we can't control. So when we're passively listening, we're only focusing on the words being said. We're listening to hear. We usually have listening faces on. I know what those look like because I'm looking at yours right now, right? And it's just focused on what information is. When you're reflectively listening, again, this is what's really happening in more of a counseling or supportive setting. You are mirroring the speaker's body language. You are parroting back or mirroring back what they have said. You're allowing them to go on tangents. You're agreeing with them to create psychological safety. When you're actively listening, you're not doing either of those things. So when you're actively listening, you are observing those nonverbal cues to understand total meaning. You are signaling your understanding through your own nonverbal cues. You're paraphrasing. You're understanding the speaker's perspective while keeping your own. And then finally, and this is really important, you are recognizing shifts, gaps, contradictions in the speaker's telling, and you're pointing them out, and you're pointing them out through questions. This is what makes it collaborative. And you can volunteer your own perspective. So this seems pretty straightforward, but active listening is hard. Why is active listening hard? Because a few things get in the way. The first thing that gets in the way is socialization. So here's something that's really interesting. The University of California, Santa Barbara looked at social conversations between men and women, and women and women. And this is what they found. In 60 minutes over coffee, men interrupted each other 7 times each. Men interrupted women 46 times. Women interrupted twice. If those numbers feel really big to you, we can look at a more conservative study that came out of George Washington, which looked at workplace conversations of about 3 minutes in length. In the workplace, we tend to adhere to more social norms, better etiquette. But here, men were still interrupting women 33% more than they were interrupting other men, about 2 times in 3 minutes. Why is this happening? Is it because men are the worst? No. It's not. It's actually socialization. It's how we're brought up. Girls are punished for interrupting when they're growing up, and boys aren't. That's what the research shows us. Boys don't get punished for interrupting, but they do get rewarded for being assertive, for sharing their opinion, for being vocal, for taking the lead in a conversation. And girls don't get rewarded for this. In fact, they're told to be more respectful or polite or deferential. Plus, that modeling idea comes up. When boys see men interrupting, they imitate the behavior. When girls see women not interrupting, they imitate the behavior. So this can make listening hard because we're socialized this way. And then it becomes even more complicated when we think about the gender spectrum and where differences are there. An example I like to give is Barbara Bars became Ben Bars, very famous biologist out of Stanford. And what Ben Bars said in a very important paper for Nature is that after the transition to becoming a trans man, interruptions just stopped. And all of a sudden, people thought Ben was a whole lot smarter. There is a real case where one of Ben's colleagues said, "I knew your sister Barbara. You're a lot smarter than her." Same person. But it's a lot easier when we have these social constructs, when we have these beliefs about what people are and aren't, to make these kinds of assumptions. So that gets in the way of listening. But then we can talk about things that aren't so DEI related, like shift response. Anybody here ever been having a conversation that you thought was about you and then all of a sudden is about another person, the person you're talking to, right? Yeah, it's like every conversation I have with one of my friends. I thought we were talking about my problem, not your book deal, but great. You know, that's shift response. Shift response is when you shift a conversation back to yourself, when the attention comes back to you. We really want to aim for support response. That's our goal, and that's when we're supporting other people's comments and conversations so they can continue making those comments. So what does that look like? So let's say we have 2 people talking to each other. Shift response is, I'm so overwhelmed, I feel like I'm never going to get a handle on what this customer wants. What the shift response looks like is, tell me about it, I'm drowning in emails, can you believe what I'm going through? Right? Support response, though, is, no, tell me about it. Why is it so overwhelming? That's the difference there. The next thing that gets in the way of listening is distraction. How many people here, and raise your hands, how many people here have been telling someone something really important and they were glued to their phone? Okay, and keep your hands up if you were that person. right? So distraction gets in the way of listening because we're bad multitaskers. It's really difficult for us to do multiple things at one time. Distraction can be on your devices. It can be because you're in a bad emotional state, or you've got a long to-do list, or the space is noisy, but distraction gets in the way of listening. So what can we do? Eliminate distraction. You're talking to this overwhelmed person. If you're distracted, you say, that sucks, and keep scrolling on your phone. But if you are engaged, you put that phone away and you make eye contact and you ask them what's going on. One thing I like to do, one trick that I find really useful, is when I'm feeling overloaded in a conversation, what I will do is I will say, I want to take a moment to just be fully present for what you have to share. Do you mind if I take a pause? And it's kind of this weird situation for people because they haven't experienced it before. But then I get to reset. I've just created an accountability partner because I just interrupted our meeting to say that I need to get present, so I better be present. And I've noticed how many people imitate me now when I do that because it allows for you to reset. Last one here is missing verbal and nonverbal cues. We don't always understand what the other person is saying, like literally don't understand what they're saying. So that can create some real listening challenges. The best example I have of this is I was on a panel, and it was an international panel. It was about bridging the gap between China and the US. And one of the panelists was an artist from China, and she said, early in my life, before I was 5 years old, I discovered the horrors of morality. And that has scarred me so deeply that I have never recovered. And then we continued the conversation there, and I'm thinking, this is a really dramatic statement. Morality has ruined your life in all of these ways, and you discovered this at the age of 4. And then about halfway through the conversation, I realized she meant mortality, fear of death. And I was thinking, wow, these questions I've been asking must be confusing to her too. Like, we are not on the same page. This is where you use a clarifying question. So, how are you feeling about this right now? Am I missing something? Did I get that right? Those are all key questions. So when you think about what we can do, it's 5 things. If you walk away with some actionable steps, 5 things. When you are trying to actively listen, always make sure that you are in a posture of receiving. Open body language. Nod, lean forward, uncross your arms. If you're seated next to someone, turn your chair around. I'm a big fan of the compassionate blink. People don't know what that is, but if you want to, you can see me after this and I can show you. Allow long pauses for processing time. I interrupt people all the time. I do, and it's because I'm an extremely fast talker. I am slowing it down so much for you right now. It is physically painful for me. So I interrupt people. My learning designer says to me on a regular basis, when you're asking the audience questions, just count to 5. That will help you here too. When paraphrasing, do end your statements with clarifying questions because sometimes they can come off as value judgments, right? Because you're not suspending your perspective. It might seem like you're telling somebody, based on how you're perceiving their mood, that they're feeling insecure because they were bad at something. And all of a sudden, they think you're making a statement about them. So instead, end with that question. Did I understand that correctly? Am I getting this right? Put away your phone. Put away your phone. Put away your phone. And then finally, ask open questions. So there are open questions and closed questions. Closed questions are yes/no responses. Open questions have infinite number of responses. Your what, why, and how are going to have more open responses than your who, when, and where. Last tool here, staying above the line. Has anybody ever seen this diagram before? Okay, I'm really excited then. This is my favorite tool. I use this in 34 companies today. I work with 34 tech companies across the US. We do all kinds of different consulting and learning and development work. This is the only tool I use with every single one of them. So imagine that there's a line, and if you are above the line, you are coming from a place of love. You are committed to learning, you are open, you are curious. If you are below the line, you are coming from a place of fear. You are defensive or defended. You are closed. You are committed to being right. Here's the deal. Because we are human, we go up and down, above and below the line, several times throughout a conversation. The key is to notice so that we can get back above the line. I can show you what this looks like. So I was in a conversation with one of my favorite people that I work with, period. But he can say some things that can be taken with offense, and I took offense, And I ended up making a really edgy comment, which is not like me. I'm very diplomatic and also very good at concealing my feelings when I have to do client service. It's a skill that's necessary for this kind of work. But I said something along the lines of, well, you only care about half of the things I'm doing anyway, so I don't know what the point is. Even when I heard it, I was like, what is up, Alita? And so I went through my own model. First thing I did, I asked, am I above the line or below the line? I was below the line. So when you're below the line, just ask yourself 3 questions. It takes like 5 seconds in your head. The first, what is being threatened here? For me, it was that the work that I was doing was not valuable. Okay, what's the next question? What do I think this conversation says about me? Well, then I'm not valuable. Has my top priority shifted to preserving my ego? Obviously, I just said I'm worried that I'm not valuable. So now that I have this clarity and this distance and this cognitive remove, what I can do is go ahead and tell this person, hey, I think I'm below the line right now, because he knows this framework too. And here's why. And I want to get on the same page. Can you clarify the comment that you made? And then all of a sudden, comment is clarified. Nothing against me, right? It's very valuable. It helps get back into a listening situation. I use this in all of my tough DEI conversations. When I have somebody feeling like they're being tone policed, or like they're being shut down, or like they're having issues with political correctness, I always go back to this framework because it is personal. So in the last 1 minute of this session, I want to do a final reflection. So I want everybody here to think about how you can apply the tools that we learned today to be more inclusive of others, right? If we said that our goal here is to use active listening to develop deeper connections with people who are not like us, to create greater understanding, what are we going to do to make that happen? Just take a moment, write it down, think it through. But you can apply some of these tools. You can use that cheat sheet. You can choose to talk to somebody that you normally don't. You can choose to engage an opinion that you don't normally want to hear. But just choose one. It's shocking and amazing how quickly you can build relationships and make progress. And the key here is that once you do this, all of a sudden you start to discover what changes you could make to create the conditions for everyone to thrive. So as a reminder here, remember, we're all imitators. If you model this behavior, other people will follow. Listening to other people who are not like us is difficult. So make sure you're putting your active listening hat on whenever you're in that kind of conversation. And then know that every single person here can become a better listener, even if you already feel like you're a good listener. Maybe in your visualization, the best listener you know is you. I mean, I'm sure that's happened before, but you can get better, and you can use that to drive change. So with that, I thank you very much for being here. I'll be out in the hallway to answer questions, but I really appreciate it.